even though it is Christmas. Should we talk about the UN Security Council, Ben, first? I watched this UN Security Council. They've adopted a resolution urging more aid for the Gaza Strip, but they have failed in terms of calling for an immediate ceasefire. This is all about the negotiations that took place behind the scenes, and it got me thinking, what's the point of the UN Security Council? Very good question.
I mean, the vast majority of their resolutions, if and when they are passed, are ignored. They passed a resolution against the Iraq War, and of course the United Kingdom and the US famously went to war anyway. They wanted to pass, I think with the exception of the US, a resolution for a ceasefire, but they couldn't get that through, so they initially went for demanding a truce. That was a few weeks ago. Well, they got that in the end, of course, but and now I think they wanted to call really for another ceasefire, but for fear of losing the US's support, they've gone for a demand for extra aid, which is a kind of statement of the obvious, really, isn't it?
Well, it is, and this resolution, Mike, was introduced by the UAE. Then obviously there was a lot of political manoeuvring behind the scenes. Then just before the vote, Russia, one of the 5 permanent members of the council, introduced this amendment, essentially saying, let's ignore this and go back to a previous draft where it did call for an immediate ceasefire. And then it argued the text gave Israel freedom of movement to further clear the Gaza Strip. Now, that was defeated, as Ben says, because of the US abstaining. 13 members of the council backed the text that calls for creating, this is what they're now backing, creating conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. How many people need to die before we actually have a ceasefire?
And the language is incredibly vague, so this is what the UK's pivoted to since David Cameron went into the Foreign Office. Saying sustainable ceasefire sounds, I mean, look, we all know what that means. That means, you know...
Cessation of hostilities, not even ceasefire.
It means returning to a state where thousands of people are not dying on either side of the borders, and the citizens of either Gaza or Israel are not paying for their intransigence of their government or Hamas's sheer ideological lunacy for the extermination of the Jewish people. The trouble is, though, that this is really comes down to the space that the Biden White House finds itself in. You have an ailing US president whose authority on the world stage is now rapidly diminishing, at the same time that demagogues like Vladimir Putin are still exerting considerable influence. This is why the post-war Bretton Woods infrastructure needs to be radically overhauled, and we need to be looking at bringing other countries like India into the fold, countries that have strong democratic bases, although you can argue about the direction of those governments, in order to ensure that the structures of governance at an international level reflect the actual geopolitics of today's world.
So there is no doubt there is a humanitarian catastrophe taking place there. And when you look at the numbers at the moment, nearly 400 people died in the last 48 hours. A quarter of households, this is 500,000 people, are in catastrophic conditions, according to the UN Food Security Agency. 2.2 million people now has acute food shortages. No one is safe in Gaza. The pressure you mentioned, Ben, about Biden, I wonder what is happening in terms of international pressure, but actually for Biden himself in the US, I get the sense that he's very much on the back foot.
In the US domestically?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it'd be absolutely tragic for the US if he's the next Democratic candidate. I mean, it'd be terrible for the US, wouldn't it? And the man doesn't know which way to go when he's exiting a stage, let alone...
To be fair, that's not unusual in US presidents as well. I grew up with George W. Bush, so you know...
And even Reagan, do you remember Spitting Image? They used to ask, the question was, where's the president's brain?
Yes, I remember, actually. It was normally over there on the plate. Yes, exactly. It was very good, that. I like that.
Oh, I miss Spitting Image. Anyway, no, I mean, on the serious point, Biden is hopeless on foreign policy, and Democrats typically are. Democrat presidents have typically caused more wars than, I mean, obviously George Bush, big famous exception to this rule.
Big exception.
Big exception. But the Democrats are not good at keeping peace. And one of the great things that Trump did, or one of the good things that Trump, great perhaps is too big a word, but one of the good things he did was not to start any wars. You know, it's remarkable.
He also brokered a lot of the UEA softening towards Israel as well. So Trump did a bit, he did his bit.
Which is basically the background to all of what has happened with Hamas, which was the fact that you've got Saudi was going to sign this deal with Israel, and of course the people that didn't like this was Hamas and all those other countries. And Iran. And Iran who backs Hezbollah and Hamas and so on.
I mean, this is just yet another proxy war, isn't it? And Hamas are the useful idiots who've gone out and created the problem for the 2.3 million people in Gaza.
So where do you stand? Because I am now so confused what the end point is for Israel. When we saw Israeli ambassadors saying there is no two-state solution, if that is where you're coming from, which I'd never heard before, because that is the aim.
That was a shock.
It was a massive shock.
It was a shock.
Because I heard that the UK and the US policy is a two-state solution. Now you've got Israeli ambassador coming out saying there will be no such thing as a two-state solution, and then reiterating the chant from the river to the sea. Essentially, we're going to wipe Hamas, everyone in the Gaza Strip, off the face of the planet, and that will be Israel.
I mean, as I say, look, this is the Holy Land. This is, it's Christmas time. We're sitting here. You'd hope there'd be a 1914 style of outbreak of peace, as you saw with the Germans and the British in the First World War.
What, a game of footy?
Well, it's something like that. But with 20,000 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip killed by Israeli airstrikes, with their sad situation with the Israeli Defence Force killed 3 Israeli hostages, with those poor people that died on October the 7th. There's a very fine line between what the Netanyahu government is doing in order to maintain legitimate self-defence, which I think it has long since passed that line now, and let's face it, Hamas are not going to de-escalate here, but the way back from this to say there is no two-state solution is setting up a permanent Syria-like situation where basically you have the words failed state there isn't the appropriate language in political science to accommodate it, I would say.
I mean, there is no solution. The minute you say there's no two-state solution, there is no solution.
Correct.
And that's very worrying. And
Hugely.
And then you have to ask yourself legitimately the question whether Israel's policy is to entirely displace the 2.3 million people. And if that is their policy, then they're getting into pretty deep water, Israel. And I think that's where they might begin to lose international support. But, you look at the 23...
They're losing it already, aren't they? They're losing it already.
Or US support.
The Biden White House is already pivoting.
So my understanding is the US and the UK underpinning foreign policy has been a two-state solution.
Yes.
Now, the question is, we now know Israel doesn't want that, but Hamas, I understand, also wouldn't want that.
Well, they've never wanted it. No.
They've been against it.
So you've got those two sides. So basically, you are combined. Both sides don't want what the international community wants.
It comes back to mutual destruction, doesn't it?
It does.
That's what they want. But I think the other issue that we ought to bear in mind is that there are 23 Arab states around Gaza and Israel, none of whom want the Palestinians, all of whom actually talk a good fight when it comes to supporting the Palestinian cause and do very little.
But not letting them in to help them in.
Not letting them in, not providing aid.
Boxing them in,
Yeah, absolutely. Egypt, perhaps.
Well, I was about to say there was talk of a state being formed in Egypt, wasn't there, at one point?
Yeah, and, to be fair to the Egyptians, why should they? But unless there's a multilateral approach to this, there won't be a solution, because Israel and Hamas are now, it would seem, Israel and the Palestinians now, it would seem, are on a path from which there is no easy return. If you don't accept the two-state solution, you're not even aiming for peace.
No, I agree.
What do you make of this? I've just had Martin message me. Good morning, all. We need to pull out of the UN and set up a new institution. United Nations of Democratic States. 5 permanent members, the US, the UK, the EU, India, Japan, and base it in Geneva.
I mean, it's an interesting idea, and I think it comes back to a broader point that this is something that they did have a hangover from the Trump era when the US retreated from the world stage, and it started with Obama's pivot to the Asia Pacific as well, that organisations like NATO become more important. But even then, we've seen with institutions like the EU, for example, the recent vetoing of aid to Ukraine by the Orban government as well, that remember that these organisations are increasingly being infiltrated by demagogic leaders as well, and we've seen the rise of increasingly, people defined as far-right leaders, even inside like Giorgia Meloni in Italy. So we have to be careful about how we define...
Meloni's a pussycat.
Yes, but don't
She's
forget...
not far right.
But,
I mean,
comparatively...
that's really interesting. I argued this point during the week, saying that it's about the way that she's interpreted, and the press call her far right. I don't think she is.
She's absolutely not far right. I mean, if you regard far right... I think as a very basic minimum, if you're part of the EU and you're far right, you want to get out of the EU. And a very basic...
I think we've been there, haven't we?
That's a prerequisite just to get onto the paper. And Meloni talks nothing. She's not pro getting out of the EU. Meloni sees her solutions through reform of the EU, and
but that's my point. There are people that traditionally, people who define centrist parties look at Giorgia Meloni, they look at Geert Wilders, and they're seeing these individuals coming in, and maybe the window has shifted. If you look at the Overton window in politics, there we go. That was a long time coming. If you look at the Overton window in politics, debate shifts over time, but some people argue that there is a certain set of parameters around which you could define as far right. There's an excellent podcast by the news agents I commend people listen to about this. It's a very balanced, informative piece.
Yeah.
But the point is that we can't even guarantee now that even so-called democratic states are immune to the pressures that we're seeing towards populism, nativism, and other forms of pressures.
Good. That's what the popular will is.
It's a combination of those things, though, that comes together. Populism, nativism, and authoritarianism coming together is a worrying combination in any
I don't
society.
see much of that in Europe. The authoritarianism. Sorry, we're going to end up in a discussion on Brexit, but the authoritarianism.
Well, Simon Calder tried to drag that into the rail strikes.
The authoritarianism, I'm afraid, comes from the intransigent, dogmatic approach to centralised forms of government, and the most vicious example of it is Brussels, where they've got very little democratic mandate, if none. Yet they come up with a whole assortment of regulations and directives which member states are meant to adopt.
I mean, and obviously we were both there at the time, and when we went in, the view was that we would reform the EU from within. It was intransigent. It was impossible to do.
It won't move.
That's what Macron's trying to do now. He's creating essentially a two-speed Europe in the sense that you have an inner core and an outer core, and I think if...
out of desperation.
Out of desperation, but that's also partly due to the reflection of the fact that you have increasing figures like Giorgia Meloni, like Geert Wilders coming into the equation. Poland, Donald Tusk's media reforms, for example, are proving very chaotic.
Well, they are. He wants to take ownership of state.
I know. It's extraordinary.
It's absolutely extraordinary. I could not believe that.
For a man who stood on the sidelines
as a massive libertarian.
Yeah, criticising Kaczynski, the head of
and that's
PIS.
exactly how the debate has moved, I think, inside Europe as well, and indeed with other
But
democratic states as well.
it's the subsidiarity. That was the reason why I voted for Brexit. So we would have the autonomy to change everything.
So democracy is returned to member states. The EU, by definition, stands against democracy.
It does.
There's no other way to interpret its existence.
Well, what they want is a federal Euro
They don't
state.
even no. That's being too kind. They want to do. They want to do away with nation states.
Yes, they do.
They want to do away with them.
Okay, fine. So you're right. They want a monolithic structure where they are it.
No borders in Europe, and thankfully, one of the best things that I've seen happen in the last few weeks is Germany, France, Slovenia, Sweden, a number of other countries say enough is enough. We're putting back our border infrastructure, and they're allowed to do that under freedom of movement in times of extremists. But this isn't a time of extremists. This is a reaction to a systemic problem that Schengen's created, which is the unbridled movement of illegal migrants across Europe.
Look at Lampedusa.
And we have to pause there, but as I say, this next election will be all about immigration. Everything pins and hangs off immigration. Stay where you are. Mike, you've had one quick message. You shouldn't wear a hat indoors. Let's have a break.